Welcome, grade 12s. Yes, you are with Ashraf Patel, and today we're looking at the production cost statement and the related notes. So in order for you to understand this section, let's just do a bit of revision of concepts that you discussed in grade 10 and in grade 11. Firstly, what does manufacturing entail? If we look at manufacturing in terms of what we need to know, one, raw materials are acquired and these are used in the manufacturing process. Two, you use labor, and this is what we refer to as direct labor, which is engaged in the process. Then you have your factory overheads, which are facilities and expenses that are utilized. Obviously, if you add these three components together, this will then give you the finished product that is then manufactured. So obviously, in the production of that item, your components would be your raw material, your direct labor, and obviously the factory overheads. Right, now, let's summarize these into the accounts that we will be dealing with, that you have dealt with in grade 11. Obviously, that knowledge is key to your understanding for what we're going to be doing in grade 12, which is the production cost statement and the related notes. We start off with the direct materials cost. Clearly, you know that deals with the raw materials. To that, you add your direct labor, people directly involved in the manufacturing process. And then you have these two components added together, right, would give you what we refer to as the prime cost. Important concept. Prime cost is made up of direct labor plus direct material. Okay, to it we add our factory overhead cost, and then that will give you your total cost of production for the current year, okay? Now, obviously, if you walk into any factory at any time, especially at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year, you're going to find certain goods that are in a semi-state of production. In other words, they're not totally manufactured, and therefore, we refer to that as your work in process, which we will add at the beginning of the year, and then we will subtract our work in process at the end of the year. This then, grade 12s, will give us our total production of finished goods for the accounting period, right? This is known as your cost of sales of finished goods. Okay, remember, it doesn't end there. We go a step further, and we say, if you take your sales of finished goods, less your cost of sales, that will then give you your gross profit. And yes, this is also examinable, where you are asked to calculate the gross profit. What is it? It's your sales less your cost of sales. Okay, then you go one step further. If you then subtract from your gross profit your selling and distribution cost and your admin cost, okay, that will then obviously give you your net profit from your manufacturing and trading. So these are important concepts that we need to take into consideration, and you will see when we do activities how they fit into the entire process. Okay, now let's take a look at these concepts in more detail. Number one, when dealing with direct materials, what are we referring to? Direct material costs would include all the raw materials purchased, whether they be for cash or on credit, keeping and taking into consideration The fact that we have raw materials on hand at the beginning of the year, as well as your raw materials at the end of the year. What is it that we want to calculate? We want the figure of the raw materials that have been issued for production. In other words, what would be the value of the raw materials that was actually used in the factory to produce the goods that we're looking at? And this is what we call the direct materials cost component. Okay, so important to note that the three cost components that which would go into manufacturing would be: one, your direct materials, which we have just discussed. Secondly, you look at your direct labor cost account. Again, the labor that is used directly in the manufacture of the product is known as productive labor, and therefore constitutes direct labor. In other words, I want you to visualize a factory. People or employees that are directly employed in the making of the product. These are what we would refer to as the direct labor expense paid by the enterprise. Yes, there are other people working in the factory. We're going to come to them just now. What are we referring to? When we talk about factory overhead costs, there are many indirect manufacturing expenses that are directly related to the production of the finished product. Let's explain that. We're saying they are not direct in terms of labor and material, but yet they would constitute as part of the cost of the product. These are what we know as your factory overhead costs. Let's take an example of some of these. What are these? Indirect materials, indirect labor, factory rent, factory electricity and water. I want you to see the common terminology here. And these are what you must pick up in the exams. The moment it gives you the word factory, it indicates to you that it deals with a factory overhead. So now, draw a distinction between labor for being direct labor. We've discussed that concept. But you also have the indirect labor component, which we call a factory overhead. At the same time, take into consideration that you also have within a factory people working with the factory, working in the factory, but they are not directly involved in the making of the product. In that case, that would be indirect labor. Give me an example of what would constitute indirect labor. People that work in cleaning the factory. Are they working in the factory? Yes, they are. Are they making the product? No, they're not involved in the production process at all. So therefore, their cost would be part of the factory overheads. The factory manager, is he or she involved in the production process? No. Is he or she working in the factory? Yes. Therefore, indirect labor. When it comes to depreciation of plant and machinery, sundry factory cost. So all of these costs, grade 12s, you can see would form part of the umbrella account, namely your factory overhead costs. And you must be able to work with each one of them to determine what component of that cost should be attributed to the factory. Okay, guys, so that means you've dealt with the three concepts: direct material, direct labor, and the factory overheads. Now, all of these definitely have to go into a common account. That's right. Why? Because in your work in process stock account, what is it that you're going to determine? You're going to bring in, firstly, your work in process at the beginning of the year. You remember our earlier slide? Yes. Then you bring in your cost components. Which three are you bringing in? Direct material plus direct labor plus the factory overheads. Right. And you also bring in your work in process at the end of the year. Remember, the one is added and the one is subtracted. So keep that as your overall picture. In fact, this account is sometimes referred to as the manufacturing account, or the way we combine all the components of manufacturing into one account. So keep that in mind. Right. Now, with regards to the gross profit, you're going to draw up a trading statement. Okay? Now, I want you now, for the next minute, to draw up for me, what do you think would go into this income statement or the trading statement of a manufacturing concern? You have 1 minute, guys. Go for it. Okay, grade 12s, what is it that you have? Remember, once you've got your sales less your cost of sales, that will give you your gross profit. Agreed? Then you take your gross profit and you subtract your selling and distribution costs. So, what are these costs? These costs are directly related to the sales of the finished product. In other words, it is an expense that will come off, it will affect my profit and loss, and therefore it will be shown in the profit and loss account. Understand that selling and distribution does not affect manufacturing, therefore will not appear in your production cost statement. By the same token, if you look at your administration cost, what are these? These costs are incurred by the management of the administration of the entire enterprise. These costs do not affect the production process, and it is treated as an expense that will affect the profit and loss of the enterprise. Once again, it will appear in your profit and loss account. So therefore, if we have to summarize the income statement of a manufacturing concern, what will we say? Sales, okay, let's do this here. You have your sales, right? Minus your cost of sales. And definitely that will give you your gross profit. So I've got sales and cost of sales. That will give me my gross profit. Remember, you're subtracting that in a bracket. That gives me my gross profit. And from that, you will now subtract your selling and distribution cost and your admin cost, and this will then give you, obviously, your net profit for the year. So, we've done important concepts in this particular section of the work. But we're going to take a break, and when we come back from the break, we're going to go into a question. See you just now. Welcome back, grade 12s. Yes, we're starting off this section with a question for you guys. You got 2 minutes now to state whether the following statements are true or false, right? So you've got 4 statements there in front of you. You've got 2 minutes. In the 2 minutes, we want you to look at each statement and say whether it is true or false. Go for it. You've got 2 minutes to do that. Welcome back, grade 12s. Let's check your answers. Let's start off with the first one that says, the break-even point represents the number of units that need to be sold to cover all costs, but no profit is made. And the answer is true. Okay? Remember, the break-even point is the point at which where we produce and sell the amount of goods where we break even. No profit or loss is made. Right. Fixed costs increase when the factory produces more and decrease when less is produced. This is false. Why? Because fixed tells you the cost remains fixed, immaterial of the level of production, right? It's a fixed cost, whether you produce 1 or 1,000, the cost does not change. Next one. Prime cost represents the total of direct material and direct labor. Certainly, that is true. Remember, your 2 components of prime cost would be material plus labor. That's right. That makes up prime cost. Next one, factory overheads are expenses incurred to run a factory, but none of them are directly involved in the making of a product. Absolutely true. Your rent of your factory is a factory overhead, It's not directly in the making of a product, but obviously you need the premises in which to operate your factory from. And therefore, factory overheads would definitely be part of the indirect cost of the product. Okay, now that we're done with the appetizer, let's move on to the main meal. Notice the trend with questions these days. You're given an appetizer to get the accounting adrenaline flowing. Once you got that out of the way, now comes the main meal, the main question. Let's focus on that now. The information given below was extracted from the accounting records of Just Shoes, producers of comfortable running shoes. The financial year ends on the 20th of February. We have to prepare the notes to the production cost statement. Yes, guys, very important. Why? Because your notes constitute the bulk of the marks. The production cost statement per se is just figures from the notes which you take to the production cost statement proper. Like your balance sheet. Remember, the notes to the balance sheet, the net figures are what we transfer to the face of the balance sheet the same way. This is how it operates. The first one we have to work out is your direct materials cost. Okay, let's look at the information that we have. We're given balances and we are given information regarding our raw materials. So let's start immediately. You're going to start off this note of direct material cost with your opening stock at the beginning of the year. Now let's check. What was the value of my materials or raw materials at the beginning of the year? Once again, important grade 12s. Remember the love arrow in accounting? Yes. Beginning of the year, end of the year. There's my beginning of the year balance, 140,000. Immediately it's given to me in my answer book. Opening stock at the beginning of the year, 140,000. Okay, now, what do I know? I purchased raw material to the value of 350,500. So immediately I say, fine, there's my purchases, 350,500. Start off with that figure. Show calculations. Grade 12s, we implore you, we beg you, make sure you show your calculations. As you can see, I'm doing just that. Okay, what else do I know about my purchases? Raw materials returned to suppliers, 6,500. Immediately I say, fine, minus 6,500. That was the raw materials that were returned to my suppliers. Okay? So obviously I've got my purchases of raw materials minus my return. What else do I know? There was carriage on raw materials of 4,600. Immediately I slot it in. Carriage on purchases, 4,600. Okay, so now we take our calculator. Let's find our calculator here. There we go. Take the 350,500. Right? Minus the 6,500. And this will give you a figure of 344,000. Okay, what is the 344,000? That would be my purchases of raw materials. Okay, now, once again, take my calculator. Take your 344,000, add, you had a figure of, let's see, what was our figure? Our figure was 140,000, therefore, add your 140,000 to that, and that will give you two components, which is 484,000. We then add our carriage on purchases, and remember, our carriage on purchases was an amount of 4,600. So therefore, we add the 4,600 as well. The calculator. Plus 4,600, and that gives you a figure of 488,600. Okay, now 488,600 is my raw materials available for processing. What do I subtract? From it, I subtract my closing stock of raw materials, which was 128,600. Therefore, 128,600 is subtracted at the end of the year. And once again, I take my calculator and I say minus 128,600, and that will give me 360,000 as my cost of raw materials. That was my direct materials cost. So once again, grade 12s, note, you take your purchases and look at adjustments in your purchases. Show your calculations in brackets. Add other components of your purchases like carriage and purchases, etc. Add it together, subtract your closing stock at the end of the year, and this will be your direct materials cost. Okay, next one. In this one here, we have to calculate our direct labor cost. Okay, let's see what information we have regarding direct labor. With regards to the total salaries and wages, it amounted to 320,000 for the financial year. The employer contributes 6% and 1% of gross salaries towards the pension fund and the UIF respectively. Okay, starting off with I need to calculate firstly that the 320,000 and when I work on my 320,000, firstly, add the 6% and the 1%. In other words, take your 320,000, which was your gross salaries and wages, total, multiplied by 7%, okay? And that will give you a figure of 22,400. Add the 22,400 to your 320,000, and it gives you a figure of 342,400. Okay, what have you done? Okay, let me explain what I've done. I've taken the employer's contribution, which was 6% and the 1%. I've added it to my gross salary. Why? Because employer's contribution would form part of my expense for salaries and wages. And that gave me a total of 342,400. Right now, 50% of that would be for employees directly working in the production process. So fine, take that figure and say times 50%. And that gives you a figure of, let's just divide that by 100 because we didn't have the percentage sign, 171,200. Okay, so what is this all about? When you are calculating your direct labor cost, let me show you. You take your initial cost, which was 320,000, right? Then, if you recall what we said, we took the 320,000 and we said times 7% to give me a figure of 22,400. There's my 22,400. So we add that plus the 320,000 to give me a figure of 342,400. Right, take that and multiply it by 50%. Why? Because only 50% of that expense is attributed to my factory. Therefore, my answer is 171,200. Okay, what did we do? Because only 50% of that expense would be for direct labor. That's the cost component that you would attribute to direct labor cost. So already you've got your direct material done and dusted. You now have your direct labor sorted out. When you come back after the break, we go on to the third note, which is your factory overhead cost component. And that's the one that has a lot of calculations attached to it. So guys, if you want to know more about the factory overhead cost, you have to stay with us. Take a break. We'll see you in a jiffy. Welcome back, grade 12s. I'm sure you had a lovely break. Good to be back with you. Right, what are we doing? We are doing the factory overheads note. Right, we start off by asking ourselves, again, look at your answer book. See, your answer book directs you as to what you need. You need the indirect labor. So, if I want the indirect labor, I need to look at the information. What am I told? 20% of that expense that we had calculated goes to indirect labor. So once again, remember your calculation. Let's do it right here. We had the 320,000, okay? We added the 22,400. I'm just going to the previous question to make things a bit easier for us. We added the 22,400, right? So we added the 22,400, and that was the component for my employer's contributions, right? This gave me a total of 342,400. But now, you need the 20% of that component, because remember, you want the indirect labor. So therefore, what you do is take your 342,400, 342,400 times the 20% now, because that is your indirect labor, and that gives you a figure of 68,480. Right, so we got 68,480 as our indirect labor. Got it? Next component you need is depreciation. Let's see, what do we have here? We are told depreciation on vehicles, not my concern, because there's nothing indicating that it's depreciation for the factory. So depreciation on factory machinery and equipment, definitely my concern. 21,600, therefore take the depreciation, 21,600, and that's your depreciation for your factory. So the operative word, guys, was factory. Factory overheads. Look at factory expenses. Okay, next one, water and electricity. What do we know? We know that water and electricity amounts to 96,000 Rand. Okay, so immediately we say, fine, take that 96,000 Rand, and we start off with the 96,000 Rand as the total water and electricity bill. But is it all for the factory? Let's see what it tells us. The water and electricity bill is shared amongst the factory, admin, and selling and distribution in the ratio 3:2:1. Immediately you tell yourself, right, if that is the situation, we got to split this up in the ratio 3:2:1. How do we do that? Add 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 1 is 6. Immediately you know that your denominator is 6. So what does the factory utilize? Let's see. The factory utilizes, obviously the factory utilizes 3. So this would mean that you would take your expense, right? And you would say 3/6, because that is the factory component of water and electricity. So now, simple, calculator, 96,000 times 3 divided by 6, which is equal to 48,000. Okay, 48,000 would be my the answer there was 48,000. Perfect. So we come here, water and electricity, 48,000. Obviously your calculation, you would show your calculation in brackets showing that you take it times 3/6, because obviously all the water electricity is not used by the factory, only a component, half of it namely, so half of the 96,000. So here's my calculation, the 96,000. Obviously, I showed you the calculation at the bottom as a calculation, but for our purposes in the answer book, please show that as well. Okay, indirect materials. Where do we start off with indirect materials? We start off with our balance of indirect materials. Do we have indirect materials at the beginning of the year? Certainly we have. Once again, your arrow, remember, beginning and end, so you don't confuse your figures. Indirect materials, beginning is 16,000. So, open bracket, 16,000, beginning of the year. Did I buy more materials during the year? Let's check. Did I buy materials? Yes. Materials costing 8,000 Rand, what about them? Were transferred from the factory to the administration office. But before we go there, did we buy materials? Certainly we did. How much? 33,600. Let's slot that one in, plus our purchase of 33,600. So we've got our opening balance plus our purchase. Now, was there a further adjustment on the indirect materials? We did allude to it. Let's go back to it. Indirect materials costing 8,000 Rand were transferred from the factory to the admin office. That means we're going to remove it. That's right. Take it out. 8,000 Rand. Remove it from here. Minus 8,000 Rand. Why? Because those were not used in the factory. They were transferred to the admin section, must be allocated to the admin section. Okay. And then finally, you bring in, did you use up all your indirect materials? No. You've got materials left over at the end of the year to the value of 11,500. So therefore, minus 11,500. Okay, now we are ready to do our calculation. And our calculation is the 16,000. Once again, watch as I'm calculating. I'm explaining what I'm taking into account to refresh our memories. Our opening balance plus our purchases of 33,600, right? Minus the 8,000 that was transferred out of there, minus the 11,500 left over. And this gives me a figure of 30,100. Therefore, there's my answer, 30,100. Okay, now in this case here, the question did not, was told you that it was indirect materials, but you could have a scenario where only a percentage of that is used in the factory. Then you would take that and multiply it by the percentage. But for this question, the entire amount is attributed to the factory. Okay, next one, sundry expenses. Let's see what it tells us. Our sundry expenses amount was 85,600. So immediately we say 85,600 for sundry expenses. And do we have further information regarding sundry expenses? Let's see. Right, sundry expenses include a prepaid telephone account of 1,600. Okay, so if it includes a prepaid expense, we must remove it from there. Your prepaid expense is for the next financial year. Okay, so 1,600, immediately I tell myself, minus 1,600, that expense is not for this financial year, it's for the next financial year. Remove it, and then look at what they tell us further. 80% of sundry expenses relates to the factory. Not all of it, only 80%. Therefore, watch my calculation. Times 80%. Okay, take out my calculator and we say 85,600 initial figure minus the prepaid expense will give me that times 80% and 67,200. Voila, I've got my 67,200 as my sundry expense. Next one, I'm told, is my rent expense. Okay, my rent expense is 220,000. Starting figure, immediately go to my rent expense, 220,000 as my starting figure. Notice grade 12s, I'm showing my calculations because part marks are given to these. Once again, make sure you show your calculations. Right, then what information do we have for rent expense? The rent amount for February will only be paid in March. That means there's an accrued expense. Rent remained unchanged during the financial year, and rent is allocated according to the floor area. Let's do the first part of the adjustment. Okay, this is what we do. We say, fine, take the 220,000, 220,000, got it? Divided by 11 because it remained unchanged for the year to give me a figure of 20,000. So add your 20,000 for your rent for the 1 month, which is an accrued expense. Remember your double entry. Debit rent expense, credit accrued expenses. Okay, now, you are then told that not all of the rent is for the factory because there's a component or a portion that has to be allocated in terms of floor space. Okay, let's see what they tell us. We are told here that the areas are as follows. 1,200 for the factory, 100 for the shop, and 300 for the office. That's right. So now we add the components. We say, fine. My components are 1,200 for the factory, plus 100 for the shop, plus, what was it? 300, I think, to give me a total of 1,600. Let's check. That's correct. So the total is 1,600 in terms of your floor space. Okay, now, you have a total floor space of 1,600. The factory uses 1,200 square meters of the total of 1,600. So immediately you tell yourself, fine, take your 220,000, which was your figure before your adjustment, right? To that we added the 20,000, so that will then give me 220,000 plus my 20,000 for my adjustment to give me a figure of 240,000. Multiply that by 1,200 divided by 1,600. And you know that that came from your total floor space. So immediately you say times 1,200 divided by 1,600, and my answer is 180,000. 180,000 would be the rent that is attributed to the factory. Okay, guys, all that you have to do now is add up all your components, your indirect labor, plus your depreciation, plus your water and electricity, plus your indirect materials, plus your sundry expenses, and your rent expense, and that would then give you the total of your factory overheads. Now watch this, please, guys. This total of factory overheads, when you use it in your production cost statement, you will get a mark irrespective of whether this figure, obviously we want it to be correct, but perchance if you've made an error somewhere, this same figure that is used in the production cost statement would definitely carry a mark. You see, if you show your workings and you work consistently, definitely in accounting, we're not there to penalize you, we're there to ensure that you get the best possible mark. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's lesson. We focused on the concepts, the production cost statement, and the relevant notes. Please make sure that you practice, and practice with what? Use past papers, other activities in which you work with these questions, and by the time you realize it, I'm sure you will be a boffin at this section. Yes, this is a definite section in your question paper in grade 12. It's a matric section and is definitely examinable. Well, guys, at the end of the show, and certainly by you practicing, you're going to be an accounting shining star. Until the next time, keep your feet on the ground and be good. Goodbye.